Spring 1763. The French and Indian War was over, but peace brought new problems for the 13 British colonies in North America. Across the North Atlantic, a new ministry was entrusted with finding the solutions. The minister would find himself grappling with issues familiar to politicians of today, and would ultimately create a rift between the colonies and Great Britain, one that would prove unbridgeable. That minister was George Grenville. George Grenville was born on October 14, 1712, the second son of Hester and Richard Grenville of Wotton Hall in Buckinghamshire. He was educated at Eton and Christ Church, Oxford, and studied law at Inner Temple. At the request of his uncle, Richard Temple, Viscount Cobham, Grenville entered into politics. In May 1741, he was elected to the House of Commons, where he would represent Buckingham for the rest of his life. Over the years, he would hold a number of government offices, culminating in April 1763 when he became First Lord of the Treasury and Chancellor of the Exchequer. 2 months earlier, France had ceded its claims to the land east of the Mississippi River. Chief Pontiac formed a confederacy from the indigenous tribes there, then launched an offensive. Pontiac was defeated by the British Army with minimal colonial assistance. Thus, Grenville's ministry decided to prohibit the colonists from moving west while land was acquired through negotiations with the indigenous population. In the meantime, 10,000 troops would be stationed in America. This posed another problem, as it was projected to cost over £220,000 a year. Britain already collected revenue from its colonies via customs duties, but Grenville would have been disappointed if he hoped these would cover the cost. Britain spent between £7,000 and £8,000 annually to collect between £1,000 and £2,000 a year. This was because a number of customs collectors stayed in Britain. Grenville thus ordered them to their colonial stations. That was the first step. 11 months after coming to office, Grenville was ready for the next phase. He presented his budget to the Commons in a speech lasting 2 hours and 40 minutes. Duties were proposed on such items as wine from the Madeiras, coffee, and foreign white sugar. The proceeds, he made clear, would be spent on colonial defense. During the speech, Grenville introduced the possibility of a stamp tax in the colonies and stressed that Parliament had the right to levy it. By this point, tax stamps had been required on paper in England for 7 decades, and extending the tax to America was not Grenville's idea. In a subsequent meeting with colonial agents, he acknowledged, quote, that all men wished not to be taxed. If the colonies were to raise the money themselves, he said, the colonial stamp tax would be averted. In Virginia, the House of Burgesses sent a petition written by George Wythe that described the parliamentary taxation of the colonies as, quote, inconsistent with the fundamental principles of the Constitution. In February 1765, Grenville met again with colonial agents, one of whom was Benjamin Franklin. This time, Grenville asked if they could agree on how much money each colony should raise. When they could not, he proceeded to introduce the stamp bill in the Commons. Its members decided to disregard the petition from Virginia, as well as those from Rhode Island, Connecticut, and South Carolina. It was estimated that the stamp duties would produce a revenue of £60,000 a year, and Grenville evidently did not think the colonial assemblies could be relied upon to provide that amount on their own accord. Baron Mansfield, Lord Chief Justice of the King's Bench, assured Grenville that it was legal for Parliament to tax British colonists. Grenville had at one point favored the idea of giving the colonists representation in Parliament, but never made the proposal as it was an unpopular idea in the Commons. The argument was made that the colonies were virtually represented in Parliament, just like residents of Britain who were not eligible to vote. However, this argument did not sway Patrick Henry, who introduced 5 resolutions opposing the Stamp Act. The 5th, which passed the House of Burgesses by 1 vote, declared that in Virginia the General Assembly had, quote, the only and sole exclusive right and power to lay taxes. That particular resolution was expunged in Henry's absence the following day. On July 10th, King George III dismissed Grenville, stating, quote, that when he had anything proposed to him, it was no longer as counsel, but what he was to obey. Before leaving, Grenville urged his king not to listen to anyone who suggested separating Britain from America. The following autumn, the Stamp Act Congress met and ultimately issued a declaration. The colonists, it read, owed all due subordination to Parliament. However, they maintained that for them to be taxed by anyone but their own assemblies went against the spirit of Britain's constitution. Just as the arguments in favor of colonial taxation did not sway the delegates to the Stamp Act Congress, their declaration did not sway Grenville. When Parliament reconvened after the Christmas recess, he stood in the Commons and said, "Great Britain protects America. America is bound to yield obedience." He then turned his attention to the opposition, saying, quote, "The seditious spirit of the colonies owes its birth to the factions in this House." Grenville's impact on America did not end with the Stamp Act. A year after his speech in the Commons, he moved successfully for the reduction of the land tax in Britain, an act which prompted Chancellor of the Exchequer Charles Townshend to levy colonial customs duties to make up the difference. Grenville warned Townshend that the colonists would not be won over by the latter's attempts to distinguish his tariff from the Stamp Act, saying, quote, "They will laugh at you for your distinctions about regulations of trade." 3 years later, a resolution was put forth attributing the ongoing disorder in America to inconsistent instructions to some of the colonial governors. Grenville argued successfully against the passage of the resolution. It would be his final speech in the Commons. On November 13, 1770, he died at his home on Bolton Street in Piccadilly. He was buried at Wotton. War broke out 5 years later. Histories of the period attribute its cause to Grenville's decisions as Prime Minister. While there is merit to this claim, whoever became Prime Minister after the French and Indian War would have faced the same problems. A change in colonial policy would likely have taken place regardless of who was in power during the post-war years. Be that as it may, Grenville was in office at that time. Through his decisions and the reaction they provoked across the Atlantic, he remains an important figure in American history. If you like our videos, please like, subscribe, and comment below.